In the second half of the 18th century, a new idea on how the economy should function started to emerge: economic liberalism. The Scottish economist Adam Smith analysed this upcoming concept in his 1776 book The Wealth of Nations, and thus laid the groundwork for Britain's economic reality in the coming decades. Put simply, economic liberals advocate for a free market where every individual has the right to trade and generate wealth as they please, with very little government intervention. The idea is that humans are inherently self-centered and only interested in fulfilling their own needs, and in doing so, benefit all of society. The invisible hand of the free market guides production, exchange and distribution in a manner that no government ever could. One classic example is that of a baker who, by pursuing his interest of not starving to death, has to bake a large amount of bread for a living. In doing so, he provides everyone around him with food and also helps to drive the economy upward, without any of this being his initial intention. This system is, of course, perfectly flawless and beneficial to everybody, and has absolutely never ever led to an unjust wealth distribution or an outright crash of the market. Who am I kidding? Of course it isn't. One very early example of what happens when the market fails to adhere to the needs of the common people was the 1766 food riots that occurred in England, especially in the southwest and in the West Midlands. The 1760s were a particularly rough decade. The 7 Years' War had plunged Britain into massive debts, and wheat harvests had been poor every year since 1763. England was now faced with an unprecedented food shortage. All this caused the price for grain and therefore bread to rise tremendously. Bread was an essential staple food, with every worker consuming about 1 kilogram every single day. Now, normally this wouldn't have been such a massive issue because the price of bread per weight had been regulated under the first assize of bread since the 1200s. The price of bread consistently remained the same even when the price of grain fluctuated. When grain became more expensive, the weight of the bread would simply be reduced, and vice versa. This prevented bakers from charging extortionate prices and profiting from food shortages. Technically, the assize was in effect until 1863, but already ceased to be enforced much earlier in many parts of England due to the rise of free market thinking. Add on top the fact that farmers and millers were way less regulated and thus exploited their position to drive up the price for grain and flour. This profit-driven approach caused the quality of the bread for the rich to rise and the quality of the bread for the poor to fall. We know that in the 1700s many millers bulked their flour with potatoes, chalk, or even rotten grains. To put it simply, the market had failed, as it had done so frequently in the preceding decades. As a result, the phenomenon of price-fixing riots started to occur all over England, in which a portion of the population decided to undertake drastic action against unfair and extortionate prices. In 1753, 700 miners from Shepton Mallet seized corn from a local warehouse and sold it at a market for a reasonable price. 3 years later, some tinners from St Agnes marched to Padstow, where corn was being stored for export. They plundered warehouses and even attempted to board trade ships. In the end, they managed to carry a significant amount of corn with them. Fast forward 10 years to 1766 and we are faced with an even worse economic situation. Riots broke out in August when a large amount of grain was exported overseas. The government tried to relieve the situation by enacting an export embargo on corn. Distilling and starch making were prohibited and all duties on foreign wheat were removed. However, the prices didn't decrease and so the riots intensified even more. By the end of the year, about 130 incidents would be recorded, some of which were quite violent. Arguably the most famous of them was the Nottingham Cheese Riot, which started out as a just cause and then descended into a chaotic battle. The annual Goose Fair opened in Nottingham on the 2nd of October. On that day, extraordinarily high amounts of cheese were put up for sale, another staple food of the time. Some traders from Lincolnshire seized the opportunity and purchased large quantities of cheesy goodness with the goal of selling the wheels in their own county for an even higher price. The locals realised what they were doing and started to worry about the fact that food was being taken away from Nottingham, which would in turn lead to even higher prices. In the 18th century, local communities were heavily dependent on their surrounding farms. National trade was not such an established concept yet, so it's easy to see why the sudden export of large quantities of food during a year as rough as 1766 caused so much widespread fear. Shortly after, just as the traders were about to load their cheese onto a cart, they got approached by some locals who demanded that they should not stir a cheese till the town was first served. The rioters took advantage of the wheel shape of the cheeses and rolled them down the streets. The mayor, who tried to calm everyone down, was knocked to the ground by one such cheese wheel, an event that would be recreated in 2016 to commemorate the 250th anniversary of that event. Some of the rioters were arrested and brought before a court in a private, unsecured house, of all places. The rioting crowd soon found the court and liberated the prisoners. Soon after, the magistrates asked the city of Derby for help. On the 3rd of October, a light horse regiment arrived with the aim of securing order and peace. In the evening, a crowd gathered at the marketplace. They started to pelt the soldiers with rocks and refused to give in. The situation escalated completely and the soldiers were given the order to fire their guns, but without bullets. One soldier accidentally loaded his weapon and shot a person called William Eggleston. Ironically, he was a farmer guarding his cheese. He later died of his wound. The crowd then marched to the wharf where they seized a ship laden with cheese. The owner attempted to negotiate and promised to sell his cheese at a much more reasonable price, but the rioters were having none of it and carried off as many cheese wheels as they could. This was, by the way, the first ever officially recorded act of cheese piracy. While the troops in Nottingham were busy with keeping the local population at bay, some rioters identified a warehouse full of cheese at Cavendish Bridge, some 16 kilometers southwest of the city. On the 6th of October, some 300 people approached the warehouse, ready to get their hands on all the cheese. Unfortunately, the building was guarded by armed men who used their firearms to drive the crowd away. The owners of the warehouse, joined by local farmers and footmen, pursued them up to the small town of Donington. They demanded that the local magistrate give them search warrants. He, however, refused because he had no interest in further escalating the situation. Furious, the owners took some ringleaders of the mob, which they managed to identify captive, and brought them before the magistrate's house, where they smashed his windows and used quote-unquote vile language. The townspeople took this as a personal attack and joined up with the rioters from Nottingham. Together they launched an attack on the cheesemongers. The Leicester and Nottingham Journal writes, "They began the assault upon the cheese factors and their attendants by discharging a great number of brick bats and stones. A scene followed of inconceivable confusion. Both horse and foot fled with the utmost precipitation, pursued by the victorious mob, who followed them quite down to the bridge, where a faint attempt was made to replace the guard in the warehouse, but the panic was so great that the men refused to stand to their arms, and the mob were suffered to enter without any molestation. One of the cheese factors, in his fright, is said to have forced his horse into the river and swam the Trent. The mob, in the meantime, soon emptied the warehouse of about 2 tons of cheese." The riot went on for a few more days, but was ultimately brought to an unpleasant end by the horse regiment. Many agitators managed to get into hiding, but others weren't so fortunate. We have 2 records of the accused being whipped, and it can be assumed that some were even hanged. A tragic end for someone who was willing to risk their own life to achieve the only thing worth dying for: affordable cheese prices for all.